For years, I mean, literally years, endurance athletes were absolutely convinced that, like, chugging a protein shake in the middle of a grueling workout was giving them this massive, like a 30% speed
No,
boost.
yeah, it was treated as gospel.
Right. People were out there choking down thick, milky drinks on the side of a highway thinking they were, unlocking elite
Which
performance.
is just a terrible visual.
It really is. And it turns out that perceived boost was basically a complete scientific illusion. Those athletes were just starving.
Literally just underfed.
Yeah. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking this massive stack of clinical guidelines, sports nutrition research, expert consensus papers, and we're just cutting straight through all the multi-billion-dollar marketing noise of the fitness industry.
Because there's so much noise out there.
So much. And our mission today is to discover the actual, biochemical truth of how to fuel the human body. Whether you're, I don't know, prepping for a marathon, playing a weekend sport, or you just don't want to feel like an absolute zombie after a 45-minute gym session.
Right. And spoiler alert here, the optimal solution rarely comes inside a giant plastic tub with a shiny holographic label.
Okay, let's unpack this, because right at the top of these clinical guidelines is this foundational concept they call the food-first philosophy.
Yeah, that's front and center.
And, we all know eating a balanced meal is generally better than swallowing a handful of pills. But why do these sports scientists and biochemists so aggressively insist that whole foods reign supreme over, like, highly engineered powders?
Well, the clinical preference for whole foods really comes down to biological synergy.
Synergy.
Right. When you consume minimally processed foods, you aren't just getting this isolated macronutrient, you're ingesting this incredibly complex matrix.
Like all the components working together.
Exactly. The vitamins, the minerals, dietary fibers, naturally occurring antioxidants in a whole food, they physically interact with each other inside your digestive tract.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they literally modulate how fast nutrients enter your bloodstream. And a single isolated supplement simply cannot replicate that kind of structural complexity.
So swallowing an ascorbic acid pill is fundamentally not the same as eating an orange, because the pill, I guess, lacks that biological delivery system.
That's spot on. The isolation actually limits the absorption. I mean, whole foods give you this broad, synergistic spectrum of micronutrients that support immune health and bone metabolism in ways that, frankly, we're still mapping out in the lab.
That makes a lot of sense.
Plus, the physical volume and structural fibers of whole proteins and fats, they provide sustained satiety. They help your body maintain homeostasis over a 24-hour period, which prevents those massive blood sugar spikes and crashes that isolate powders so often trigger.
Right. Nobody wants that crash. Now, looking at this research, I definitely don't want to tell everyone listening to just go throw out their entire pantry.
No, please don't do that.
Right. The guidelines aren't saying supplements are inherently toxic or useless, are they?
No, not at all. The consensus actually classifies them as conditionally essential.
Conditionally essential?
Yeah, they're strategic tools designed to fill logistical gaps.
Like what?
Well, say you just finished a late-night away game, right? And sitting down for a comprehensive meal of chicken and rice just isn't practical before you get on a bus.
Yeah, you just need something fast.
Exactly. A protein shake is an excellent tool there. Or if you live somewhere where accessing fresh, fatty fish is really difficult, an omega-3 capsule is a great intervention. But they're gap fillers. They are not the structural foundation of human performance.
Okay, so if we establish that solid whole food foundation, we have to look at the massive energy demands of a working system. And we need to move away from that tired old cliche of, the body's a car and carbohydrates are the gas.
It's just way too simplistic.
Right. Reading the breakdown of how the body utilizes glycogen, it's actually much more accurate to think of your body's energy system like a dynamic biological battery grid.
I love that. That is a much better framework. Because muscle glycogen, liver glycogen, and circulating blood glucose, these are essentially your localized high-voltage battery packs.
Okay.
And for decades, the sports world prescribed this universal high-carb charging protocol to literally everyone who laced up a pair of sneakers.
Like carbo loading the night before a 5K.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the modern clinical guidelines completely dismantled that idea. There is no universal approach. Your carbohydrate intake must be highly individualized based on the specific storage capacity of your body mass and, the daily depletion rate of your training load.
Because obviously, a 50-kilogram gymnast and an 80-kilogram rower are operating entirely different power grids.
Entirely different.
The math on this customization is staggering, actually. The guidelines break it down by grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight. So on a low-intensity day, maybe you're just doing skill work or taking a rest day, you only need about 3 to 5 grams per kilogram to keep the grid online.
Which is manageable.
But if you shift into high-volume training, meaning like 4 more hours a day of intense effort, that demand skyrockets to an astonishing 8 to 12 grams per kilogram.
And just to contextualize that higher range, it is a massive, almost overwhelming volume of food.
I can imagine.
It has to be, because your central nervous system and your skeletal muscles just burn through that localized glycogen with brutal efficiency when you're doing high-intensity output.
Okay, let's ground this so you listening can actually visualize what we're talking about. Let's take a 60-kilogram athlete, that's roughly 132 pounds, right?
Yep, pretty average.
On a moderate training day with maybe 1 hour of intense working out, the research says they need between 5 and 7 grams per kilogram. So that means they have to consume 300 to 420 grams of carbohydrates.
That's a lot of carbs.
To put that on a physical plate, 30 grams of carbs is roughly equivalent to a full cup of cooked pasta, or a large banana, or a medium potato. So to hit just the low end of that moderate target, you're eating the equivalent of 10 cups of pasta throughout the day.
Yeah, you don't just accidentally consume that optimal amount without a serious intentional strategy.
No way.
And that strategy becomes infinitely more complex when we look at the requirements for fueling while the system is actively under load.
Right, in-game fueling. According to the data, if your workout is under an hour, you generally don't need to add fuel to the grid mid-session.
You're fine.
But once you cross that 75-minute mark, the battery packs basically start blinking red.
They really do. For moderate exercise lasting 75 minutes to 2.5 hours, the clinical requirement is 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour just to maintain your peak power output.
Okay.
But for prolonged sessions, anything extending beyond 2.5 hours, the requirement jumps to 90 grams per hour.
90 grams an hour. I mean, if I tried eating 3 large bananas every single hour while running a marathon, I would be doubled over in a ditch with stomach cramps.
Oh, absolutely. But what's fascinating here is the biochemical mechanism the research recommends to bypass that exact gastric distress.
Tell me.
It's a protocol called multiple transportable carbohydrates.
Multiple transportable carbohydrates. So if I'm consuming just one type of sugar, say pure glucose, it's essentially like a massive crowd trying to leave a stadium through a single exit door, right? It inherently bottlenecks.
That's a perfect analogy. The glucose relies on a specific intestinal transporter called SGLT1. And you're completely correct. That physiological doorway physically maxes out at processing about 60 grams of glucose per hour.
Wow, okay.
So if you consume 90 grams of pure glucose, those extra 30 grams just back up in your gut.
Yeah.
They draw water into the intestines, and that is what causes that severe cramping and nausea you mentioned.
Oh, but by mixing different sugars, like specifically adding fructose to the glucose, you're essentially unlocking a completely different set of doors for a different group of people.
Yes, exactly. The fructose utilizes an entirely separate pathway called the GLUT5 transporter.
Nice.
So by utilizing multiple transportable carbohydrates, you basically have 2 distinct exits operating simultaneously. Your body absorbs significantly more fuel per hour than it ever could from a single type of sugar alone.
So you maximize energy delivery while minimizing the risk of a digestive bottleneck.
Precisely.
Which perfectly explains why the guidelines emphasize this concept of training the gut.
Oh, that's huge.
Yeah, you can't just dump a complex matrix of mixed sugars into your stomach on race day and expect it to go well. Just like you apply progressive overload to your skeletal muscles to make them stronger, you basically have to apply periodized training to your digestive system.
Yep.
You literally have to practice digesting under physical duress to alter your gastric emptying rates.
You're constantly balancing energy delivery against physical comfort. An athlete's gut needs actual time to upregulate those SGLT1 and GLUT5 transporters.
They need to build more doors.
Exactly. If an athlete feels nauseous during early training, they typically shift from solid foods to maybe a 6% liquid carbohydrate solution, and then gradually increase the concentration as their digestive tract adapts to the stress.
Okay, so we've charged the battery grid with customized carbohydrates. We've trained the gut to absorb fuel on the move, and we've pushed the body to its absolute limit.
We're exhausted.
Right. But when you redline the grid like that, the physical infrastructure takes a beating. You create micro tears in the muscle tissue. So now we must shift our focus from power generation to structural renovation.
Time to bring in the protein repair crew.
Yes, your body is in a constant dynamic state of what biochemists call muscle protein turnover. It's simultaneously breaking down old or damaged muscle tissue, which is a process known as catabolism, and building new functional tissue, which is synthesis.
Right.
Which brings me back to that illusion we talked about at the top of the deep dive. The people chugging protein shakes in the middle of a heavy deadlift session or long bike ride. If muscle is breaking down during the workout, shouldn't adding the repair materials right then and there give you a performance boost?
You'd think so, but if we isolate the clinical consensus across all major sports nutrition bodies, the answer is a definitive no.
Wow.
Yeah, co-ingesting protein with carbohydrates during a 1 to 2 hour event does absolutely nothing to improve your immediate power output or speed compared to consuming carbohydrates alone.
So, where did this massive myth originate? Why did an entire generation of athletes think protein was this mid-workout stimulant?
The literature actually refers to it as the energy deception.
The energy deception.
Yeah. Back in the day, researchers conducted these trials where athletes consumed protein during their workouts, and they miraculously recorded this 30% boost in performance.
Which sounds incredible.
It does. But when modern biochemists audited those early studies, they found a really glaring methodological flaw. The athletes in the control groups were vastly underfed. They were only being given roughly 26 grams of carbohydrates for the entire session.
Wait, based on the math we literally just did, 26 grams isn't even a single banana's worth of energy?
Right.
The grid was completely depleted?
Completely. So when researchers gave the test group protein on top of those 26 grams of carbs, of course they performed better. But not because protein has magical mid-workout properties.
Yeah.
They improved simply because their starving bodies were finally receiving extra calories to burn for survival. If those extra calories had just been more carbohydrates, the performance result would have been identical, if not better.
That is wild. It was literally a calorie deficit masquerading as a protein victory.
Exactly.
So unless you're out there grinding through a massive ultra-endurance event lasting 6 or 7 hours, where a tiny bit of protein can prevent your body from cannibalizing its own muscle tissue for emergency fuel, you do not need the repair crew on site while the building is still on fire.
Well said. The true priority of protein is long-term structural adaptation. It's for the aftermath. When you consume dietary protein, the essential amino acids, specifically one called leucine, act as the biological triggers to initiate muscle protein synthesis.
Okay, let's talk about the specific numbers required to trigger that renovation.
Sure. For standard daily training, athletes should aim for a baseline of about 1.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. Interestingly, though, on recovery days, when the actual tissue rebuilding occurs, that target jumps to 2.0 grams per kilogram.
Oh, it goes up.
It goes up.
Mm-hmm.
And if an athlete is in a caloric deficit, like they're attempting to lose fat while fiercely protecting their existing muscle mass, the requirement scales all the way up to 2.4 grams per kilogram.
See, here's where it gets really interesting. Because the research points out that hitting that big total number by the time your head hits the pillow just isn't enough. There is a strict physiological roadblock called the ceiling effect.
Yes. This is a crucial mechanistic concept. The human body maxes out its muscle repair response at a very specific acute threshold.
Right. The clinical data shows that your muscle repair machinery basically plateaus at about 0.25 to 0.30 grams of protein per kilogram per meal.
Per meal. That's the key.
So for an average 70-kilogram person, that's roughly 20 to 30 grams of protein in a single sitting, which is roughly a cup of Greek yogurt or 4 eggs or a small chicken breast. But what actually happens biologically if I eat like 80 grams of protein in one sitting?
Well, you trigger a process called amino acid oxidation.
Oxidation.
Yeah, unlike carbohydrates, which can be stored as glycogen or dietary fat, which is easily stored in adipose tissue, your body literally lacks a storage vault for excess protein.
It just can't keep it.
Right. Once you hit that 20 to 30 gram threshold, your synthesis machinery is fully saturated. Any amino acids floating around beyond that point are oxidized. They're stripped of their nitrogen and either burned as a highly inefficient energy source, or they're just excreted as waste.
Which brings us to arguably the most common dietary mistake the guidelines highlight: the dinner trap.
Ooh, the dinner trap.
Think about your own day yesterday if you're listening. Let's say you grabbed a plain bagel on your commute. You ate a light green salad at your desk for lunch, and then you sat down at 7 p.m. to this massive 16-ounce ribeye steak. completely confident that you hit your daily macro targets.
Sounds pretty standard for a lot of people.
Right. But according to the biology of the ceiling effect, your body was actually starved of repair materials for 14 straight hours.
Yep. During all those hours, your muscle turnover was heavily skewed toward catabolism breaking down.
And then at dinner, you backed up a massive dump truck full of bricks when the structural repair crew only had the capacity to use a single wheelbarrow.
That's exactly what happened.
The rest of those expensive bricks were basically just tossed into the metabolic landfill.
To actually optimize recovery, you must pulse your protein intake. You have to space out those 20 to 40 gram doses every 3 to 4 hours. You need to consistently flip that anabolic synthesis switch throughout the entire day.
And the sources also highlight this fascinating biological hack for this pulse strategy. One of the most robust findings in modern sports nutrition is pre-sleep protein.
This is a game changer.
It really is. If you consume 30 to 40 grams of a slow-digesting casein protein, which you can find in things like cottage cheese or high-quality Greek yogurt, about 30 minutes before you go to sleep, the casein actually forms a gel in your stomach.
Which sounds weird, but it's brilliant.
It is. It provides this slow, sustained drip feed of amino acids into your bloodstream all night long. You are literally rebuilding your physical infrastructure while you're completely unconscious.
It is a highly efficient strategy, particularly for anyone managing a heavy training load. And clinical trials show that this pre-sleep feeding doesn't impair overnight fat metabolism at all, and it may even elevate your resting metabolic rate the following morning.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So, okay, we have the localized battery packs charged with carbohydrates. We have the structural renovation handled by perfectly spaced pulses of protein. But without insulation on those electrical wires, without the flexible protective boundaries that keep the physical house intact, the entire system eventually shorts out.
It falls apart.
And that is the critical role of our third macronutrient, dietary fats.
Right, and dietary fats are vastly misunderstood. They're often reduced to just being viewed as calorically dense liabilities.
Right, something to avoid.
Exactly. But they are the literal lipid bilayer of every single cell membrane in your body. They are the chemical precursors required to synthesize essential steroid hormones, like testosterone and estrogen, which regulate your overall growth and recovery.
Wow.
And without sufficient dietary fat, your intestines physically cannot absorb fat-soluble vitamins, so vitamins A, D, E, and K.
Which is exactly why the clinical consensus issues such a stark warning against aggressive low-fat diets. The physiological rule is that dietary fat should constitute 20% to 35% of your total daily energy intake.
Absolute.
If you drop below that 20% threshold in an attempt to, get incredibly lean, you're playing a dangerous game. You're starving your endocrine system, cratering your hormone production, and dramatically increasing your risk of stress fractures and illness.
This raises an important question, though, because in the current fitness landscape, we're seeing the exact opposite extreme trending aggressively.
You're talking about the high-fat ketogenic protocols.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And we have to look impartially at what the sports science actually demonstrates regarding these fat-adapted diets.
Okay.
Despite the immense cultural popularity of keto, the clinical data shows that high-fat diets do not consistently improve athletic performance, and in many cases, they actively impair it.
Yeah, I was reading the metabolic breakdown of this, and the math on fat oxidation completely explains why. To produce ATP, which is cellular energy from fat, your body actually requires substantially more oxygen than it does to produce that same energy from carbohydrates.
It requires about 10% to 15% more oxygen to metabolize lipids compared to glycogen.
Right. So if you're in the final sprint of a race or pushing a heavy sled, your heart and lungs are already redlining. You physically cannot bring in more oxygen.
They're maxed out.
So if your body is adapted to only burn fat, you've artificially capped your high-end power output because your system simply cannot supply the immense amount of oxygen required to fuel it at those speeds. Fats are an incredible, slow-burning diesel fuel for long, low-intensity efforts, but they cannot replace carbohydrates as the high-speed fuel for explosive output.
Which is why maintaining that balanced 20% to 35% sweet spot is ideal. And within that lipid profile, the research heavily isolates omega-3 fatty acids, specifically EPA and DHA, as the athlete's ultimate cellular armor.
Yes, the omega-3 family is considered essential because the human body cannot synthesize them from scratch. And their biological mechanisms are incredible.
Oh, they're amazing.
They literally incorporate into your cell membranes, improving the flexibility of your red blood cells. That means oxygen can slip through your capillaries and reach your fatigue muscles much faster. They also actively manage the severe localized inflammation that follows intense tissue damage.
Furthermore, they offer profound neuroprotection.
Right, for the brain.
Exactly. The sources highlight this specifically for athletes involved in contact sports, whether that's rugby, martial arts, football. High levels of EPA and DHA help the brain mitigate the inflammatory cascade triggered by repetitive traumatic impacts.
But there is a massive biological catch here.
Yes, there is.
You might think you can just, sprinkle some flax seeds or chia seeds onto your morning oatmeal and assume your brain is shielded, but plant-based omega-3s are primarily ALA. The human body's conversion rate from ALA into the protective EPA and DHA forms is astoundingly inefficient.
It really is.
It's often less than 5%.
It is a severe biological bottleneck.
Yeah.
The only truly reliable method to ensure you have therapeutic levels of EPA and DHA is direct intake from cold water fatty fish like salmon, mackerel, or sardines, or through a meticulously sourced high-quality supplement.
So what does this all mean? We have journeyed through the biochemistry of transporters, oxidation, and lipid bilayers. How do we translate these grams and metabolic pathways onto a literal, real-world plate? Because obviously someone casually hitting the gym doesn't require the same grid capacity as an Olympian.
Well, it ultimately comes down to aligning your plate directly with your specific mechanical output. The clinical guidelines offer an illuminating comparison here between completely different modalities.
Yeah, let's contrast the triathlete against the CrossFit athlete.
Okay, so a triathlete engaging in steady-state endurance training for roughly 110 to 140 minutes a day is draining massive amounts of energy over a long duration.
Okay.
Their plate requires extreme carbohydrate loading between 5.5 and 7.3 grams per kilogram to sustain that output, paired with a moderate fat intake around 28% to 31% of their total energy.
But then you analyze the CrossFit athlete. Their training duration might only be 40 to 90 minutes a day, but the intensity is explosive. The data indicates they actually require fewer total carbohydrates over a 24-hour period, around 3.4 to 3.8 grams per kilogram. But to support the intense hormonal and structural recovery from moving such heavy loads, their fat intake scales significantly upward, approaching 38% to 39% of their total energy.
Which perfectly illustrates the point.
Yeah, so the practical takeaway for you listening is that you must ruthlessly and honestly evaluate your own daily output. If you're doing a brisk 45-minute gym session before sitting at a desk all day, your biological grid needs to reflect that moderate output. You shouldn't blindly replicate the massive carbohydrate loading of an elite Ironman competitor.
Definitely not.
But conversely, you shouldn't starve yourself of the targeted glycogen you need to push through a heavy lifting session.
It is the essence of personalized nutrition. The clinical biochemistry establishes the physiological baseline, but you must tune the specific dials based on the reality of your daily life.
Let's do a rapid-fire recap to lock these mechanisms in. First, embrace the food-first approach. Whole foods provide a synergistic biological matrix that isolated supplements simply cannot replicate.
Absolutely.
Second, treat carbohydrates as your dynamic battery grid and customize your intake to your specific daily output. Third, beat the biological ceiling effect of protein.
Avoid the dinner trap.
Right. Do not fall victim to the dinner trap. You must pulse 20 to 40 gram doses every few hours to keep the structural renovation active. And finally, maintain the structural integrity of your cellular membranes and hormones by keeping dietary fats in that 20% to 35% sweet spot, prioritizing direct sources of EPA and DHA.
You know, if we connect all of this to the bigger picture, there is a fascinating concept from today's sources that really lingers.
Let's hear it.
We spent time unpacking the mechanics of training the gut, forcing the digestive tract to upregulate transporters and absorb fuel under extreme physical duress. We're treating the digestive system as highly adaptable infrastructure.
The reality that digestion is a trained skill, not just a passive bodily function.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder about our modern environment. When we experience severe psychological stress, like a high-stakes meeting or a massive deadline, our sympathetic nervous system spikes, and blood flow is actively diverted away from the digestive tract.
Oh, wow.
Right. So how much of our everyday afternoon fatigue or mental sluggishness isn't actually a lack of caloric energy, but rather a digestive system that is profoundly out of shape?
God, it's wild to think about.
If elite athletes can periodize and structurally train their gut to process complex fuel efficiently while their bodies are under extreme physical duress, what would happen if we applied that same deliberate structural training to how we process and digest our meals during highly stressful workdays?
That is a phenomenal thought to leave on. Are we truly underfueled, or is our biological machinery just undertrained at digesting while we're swimming in modern stress hormones? Something to chew on during your next properly pulsed whole food meal. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.